with Chapter 3, Full Confessions. I am going to start. On Thursday morning, the undersheriff called Lieutenant Miller into his office and told him he had just received a phone call from a Farmington woman who said her daughter, a student at Farmington High School, had been told by a girlfriend that she had overheard a boy in school ask another boy if he wanted to see a finger he had taken off a dead Indian. The lieutenant looked at him and waited. Not only was it hearsay, factually it didn't coordinate with anything they had. There were no digits missing on either of the bodies. Brown read his thoughts. Hey, I'm just repeating what she said. Did she mention the reward money? She said she didn't want nothing to do with the reward. She didn't want her name associated in any way. Hello, here's the information. Goodbye, the way it went. Doubtful as he was, he thought it was probably some kid who'd read in the papers about the homicides. Shooting his mouth off to get attention, Miller said he would check it out. Built in the late 1950s, the cement and glass buildings that made up Farmington High School sprawled over 37 hillside acres north of downtown. The community was growing fast at the time, and a facility to accommodate the children of the boomers needed to grow. As a result, a campus-like setting evolved with different buildings for each department. The student body numbered about 1,800, of which 25% were Hispanic, 19% Indian, 1% Black, and the rest Anglo. The school colors were green and white. Its yearbook was called Navajo for Roundup, and its mascot was a scorpion. Lieutenant Miller was at home around the high school before going to work for the sheriff's office. He had been a juvenile probation officer for the county, a truant officer for the Farmington school system, but it had been several years since he had an occasion to pay a visit. So he was surprised when he walked into the office of the assistant principal, Barry Sigmon, and found himself received as if he were expected. Sigmon was a stocky, dark-haired man who looked more like a football coach than dean of students, until you knew his position put him in charge of disciplinary matters at the high school. After shaking hands, Sigmon closed the door behind them and said, "Showing up like this, you'd save me a phone call." Taking a seat at his desk, Sigmund gestured to a chair before he explained, "The corridors are buzzing with disturbing rumors about the statements on one of our students is making about Indians. Some say they think he may know something about the murders." "Is his name Vernon Crawford?" Miller asked. Sigmund's eyebrows went up. He nodded. "How did you know? We got a phone call. Said the same. What do you make of it?" The assistant principal shrugged. "I don't know. Kids will say anything. I find it hard to believe a student could be mixed up in something that heavy. But as soon as I say that, one make a liar out of me." "What have you heard he's saying? Bizarre stuff, dismemberment of Indians?" The lieutenant was silent. "What can you tell me about the kid?" Showing Miller his palms, the assistant principal said not much. "He's a junior. Neither a scholar nor an athlete. Kind of a loner." "As far as I know, there are no disciplinary reports. I could think of a lot more likely suspects before Vernon Crawford's name came to me." Miller thought a minute before asking, "Would there be any way in the world, keeping everything quiet and whatnot, that you could find out what kind of shoe this kid wears? And if it's a wafer stomper, what the sole looks like?" Sigmund's eyes narrowed. If a high school student was involved, or if it was a matter of clearing one of the suspicion, either way he wanted the doubt resolved. You bet, he said without hesitation. Sammy Waldrop was the junior level creative writing teacher at Farmington High in 1974. She was 30 years old but looked younger, slender, leggy, and pretty enough to draw wolf whistles in the corridors. She was also popular with her students because she demonstrated a caring about them that went beyond their performance in the classroom. She was new in the school system, which was how she ended up teaching writing. It was a course nobody else wanted. I had a background in English, so they gave it to me. It was during the lunch hour that the assistant principal approached Sammy and asked her to do a little detective work for me. When Barry Sigmund came up to me in the teacher's lounge and said, "I want you to find out what size shoe Vernon Crawford wears, and if he's wearing waffle stompers, what the bottom looks like," I thought it was a strange request, but I didn't think a lot about it. I figured it probably had something to do with an infraction in the cafeteria where they had been a series of altercations. At the same time, it bothered me. Of all students, Vernon Crawford was implicated in some sort of trouble. I had been worried about him all year. He was an odd boy. I felt sorry for him. I also found him slightly frightening. For some reason, he had taken a special liking to me. He brought me a recipe for fry bread once when I told him it was one of my favorite foods. Another time, he gave me a yellow butterfly pin inside a plexiglass box. For no reason, just a gift. I thought maybe he was drawn to me because, as he told me after class one day, his parents were never around. I tried to give each of my students individual attention. I wanted my class to be a place where everyone could freely express his innermost thoughts, and I would listen to what they said or wrote as the case might be, and give them my honest response. With Vernon Crawford, this was hard to do. He had a habit of doodling on scratch paper during class and handing these sketches to me afterward, as if he were turning in an assignment. Almost all were mildly pornographic renderings of Indians. The women were scantily clad and well endowed. The genitals of the men were oversized. Almost worse were his short stories. There was sex and mayhem and terror in almost every story he wrote. I'll never forget one of them was about those people who lived in a mansion and who committed unalivings and destroyed the evidence of their crime by unaliving the bodies and feeding them to dinner guests. Vernon referred to the cuts of meat by name, Jamie Roast and Susie Steak. I didn't know what to make of them. I thought I wanted to believe the class was offering him an outlet for his violent energies, and that drawing and writing them would be catharsis. When I tried to discuss the issue with fellow teachers, they thought I was making a big deal out of something harmless, and even I couldn't bring myself to believe he would actually enact any of the awful things he was writing. Ours was the first class after lunch, and as I watched the students file in, I saw, I had never noticed this before, that everyone except one girl and myself wore hiking boots. I watched Vernon take his seat, and when he looked up, I smiled at him and said, "My gosh, Vernon, you certainly have big feet." With a grin, he lifted one of his feet into the air and said, "Yep, I bet nobody else in class wears a 12.5. Getting the size was that easy. Finding out what the sole looked like wasn't much more difficult. I assigned an in-class essay, and while the students wrote, I sat at my desk at the front of the room with a blank pad in front of me and waited for Vernon Crawford to cross one leg over the knee of the other. Lieutenant Miller spent the rest of the day doing a background check on Vernon Crawford, moving up and down the halls and around the grounds between classes. He would spot a kid he'd been dealing with before and call him over for a chat. You weren't going to find the names of the kids on the honor roll, a fair number he met at the police station in the middle of the night, and lectured their parents on the need for discipline, but with most he felt they had an understanding that allowed him to ask them, "Tell me what you know about Vernon Crawford," and get a straight answer. The lieutenant conducted his research as if he were planning to write a biographical quickie on the kid, asking for anecdotes and quotes, nipping and tucking questions into his interrogation about Crawford's attitude toward Indians. The character that emerged was goofy and juvenile. What he heard repeated like a refrain was, "He's just weird," but no one he talked with admitted to having actually seen Crawford produce any Indian fingers for viewing. By the time he closed his notebook, the day was over, so Miller had to wait until the next morning before he called the assistant principal for an update. "Any luck?" he said. "Come on up," Barry Sigmund said. "I think I have what you're looking for." 15 minutes later, the assistant principal reached in his desk drawer, withdrew a sheet of white paper, and handed it across to the lieutenant. The teacher's drawings of the boot sole so perfectly matched the photos of the boot print from the crime scene. It could have been traced. 1 4-pointed star in the heel, 6 of the same in the sole. To steady his shaking hands, Miller leaned forward, elbows on knees, and had to admit when he had asked himself what kind of mind could conceive and execute 2 agonizing unalivings by torture, he had never seriously considered the possibility it was a goddamn 11th grader. The crime had been so vile, so far beyond anything he had seen before, that even now it was hard to believe. And yet there was no doubt in his mind that the Crawford kid was involved, and with the conviction came a connection. Could this be the message behind the headlessness? Was the lack of Was the lack of circumspection that characterized the crime scene, tracks everywhere, bodies brazen, abandoned in a place where they were sure to be found, the headlessness of adolescence. The only other person in the sheriff's office who knew the lead Miller was working was Doug Brown. Miller not only wanted confidentiality, he had insisted on it. Let's don't put this no place where it can be seen, he said to the undersheriff before heading for the high school, "at least until I've had a chance to look into it a little further." Behind this request was the memory, not so long before, of having been beaten on a murder case because a Farmington police officer had carefully leaked information that warned a suspect, allowing him to destroy critical evidence before he had been picked up. Miller's concerns in this situation was that the sheriff, who was feeling the heat from the press, might let out that they were about to break the case, throwing an alarm that could trigger the same response. And he had no intention of informing the sheriff of the progress he'd made, even as they sat around the table at Van's that Friday afternoon, swapping news. But when the opportunity presented itself, he was unable to resist the temptation to drop a big hunt. At a certain point in the conversation, when Sullivan was worrying out loud about how the headlines looked, the lieutenant made an elaborate show of checking his watch before aiming a glance at the sheriff and saying, "Give me an hour and 45 minutes and I'm going to tell you who killed them Indians." To this day, Miller recalls Sullivan's response with particular satisfaction. He snorted and gave me a "you crazy bastard" look. Then he let his mouth overload itself. "You do," he said, "and you got 2 weeks vacation coming to you." "I'll take it," I told him. All Rena Benally knew about the particulars of the crime was what she had read in the newspaper. But she had heard different dreadful versions from others that, added to her own upsetting visions, had unsettled her sleep with nightmares. And so when the deputy who had interrogated her contacted her again, this time offering to take her out to the murder scene and to answer all her questions, she went. But she refused to ride in the same vehicle with him, instead following his patrol car out to Chokecherry Canyon in a pickup truck driven by Benji's brother. When they parked at the edge of the natural rock amphitheater and walked along the rim of the cliff that gave her a good view of a flat sandy area dotted with the sparse growth of dry country vegetation, the term Widow's Walk came to mind. "This is where we think they threw him off," the deputy said, motioning downward. Rena swept the earth beneath her with her eyes, as if she believed the sounds of tragedies were somehow recorded in the landscape and could be heard if one listened closely. She strained to hear a distant sound from that night, but the quiet was complete, so she turned to her imagination, and for a dizzy moment it was as if it were happening again, only she was there like a shadow watching 2 men lead her husband toward his death. It is dark, so he can't make out their faces, but he can hear their quick hard breathing as they walk her husband up the ridge. 2 against 1 makes the scuffle a short one, and with a big shove from behind, the ground gives way beneath, and Benji cartwheels through the night with nothing to grasp to break his fall. The ground at the base of the cliff was thoroughly trampled by the investigating authorities, but she knew that among the many prints mussing the sand were her husband's, and that was enough for her to feel she could track the trail of his flight. The evidence, backed by the deputy's tense narrative, told of a wild midnight chase as her husband frantically tried to outrun his tormentors, scramble to avoid their instruments of torture, crawl defensively on hands and knees when he could do little else. I wonder what he said when they were torturing him. Knowing him, I think he was trying to say something or talk to them. And I think they were probably surprised at his English because it was better than mine. Maybe he was trying to talk his way out of whatever he was going through. Whatever it was they were trying to make him do, I know they must have been trying to make him do something. What, I don't know, but maybe he wouldn't do what they said, and that's the reason they tortured him. "Here is where we found him," the deputy said. Pieces of shard fabric peppered the ground beside patches of blood-caked sand. She stared at the depressions left by rocks that were now resting on the floor of the evidence locker at the sheriff's department in Aztec. Smeared with her husband's blood, stirring the ground with her foot, she unearthed something that caused her to drop to one knee. She came up holding a fire-blackened section of pants zipper in her palm. "I heard he was castrated," she whispered. The deputy's voice was naturally raspy, but sounded more so when he said, "Mrs. Benally, your husband was so drunk. I don't think he felt much. But it wasn't alcohol that killed him. Yes, he was probably drunk, but alcohol didn't drive him out here and take his life. He was murdered." While interviewing classmates about Vernon Crawford, Lieutenant Miller had repeatedly asked for the names of his friends. He doesn't really have any friends, he'd been told. The guy's a loner, he pressed a question. Surely there was someone in school friendly with him. That was when the name Orrin Thacker was mentioned. Not that they hung out together, just that they had several classes in common and were sometimes seen in each other's company. Orrin Thacker. Though he did not know the youth, Miller reorganized the family name. The father was a co-owner of a trucking firm that delivered water to the oil fields. The mother, an upstanding lady in the community. Both belonged to the San Juan County Country Club. Since school was already in session, rather than pull the kid out of class for questioning, Miller had decided to wait until the afternoon. From his sources, he had learned that Orrin Thacker worked part-time after school pumping gas at a downtown service station. So after lunch at Vans, he drove to the station, let the manager know he needed to talk with Thacker when he showed up, then took a seat in his country car beside the undersheriff, who wouldn't have missed this occasion for the world. Around 3:30, Orrin Thacker arrived for work. He looked like a typical 16-year-old to the lieutenant, pushing 6 feet, rangy, and with unkempt brown hair. Your paper boy, after his voice changed when he called the youth over and asked him to get in. Thacker did not behave like someone who had something to hide. He seemed more concerned about getting into trouble with his boss than the law. "It's okay," Miller assured him. "I've already cleared it and this shouldn't take long." At that time, the sheriff's office had a substation in Farmington, a room in a county building, furnished with a desk, 2 chairs, typewriter, and a telephone, and that was where they went to talk. Miller did not begin by advising the kid of his rights and coming on like the bad cop. The hand was playing presumed innocent on Thacker's part. "I understand you're buddies with Vernon Crawford," he began. Thacker nodded. Wasting no words, the lieutenant said, "Then you probably know he's in a heap of trouble." Something sparked in the back of Thacker's eyes. "No," he mumbled, "I didn't know that." Miller said, "We hear he's been saying some pretty strange things about Indians. What can you tell us about it?" There was an overlong pause. Now the boy seemed scared. His eyes were jumpy when he answered, "I didn't hear anyone." Sensing the kid was wrestling with loyalties, Miller spoke gently. "Come on," the kid was wrestling with loyalties. Miller spoke gently. "Come on, son, I think you know what I'm getting at." When the words came, they seemed to be choked out at first, but then they flowed in a torrent that gave Miller the impression the kid was almost relieved to tell what he knew. He let them talk for only a few minutes before stopping him and leaving the room to make a phone call. When he had Tom Hines, the assistant district attorney, on the line, he told them, "Tom, I've got a boy here and the story he's telling is getting heavy. I think you better come down." Voluntary statement, Orrin Thacker, 4/26/74. Question: Orrin, do you go to school? "Yes, sir, I do." "Where?" "At Farmington High School. I'm a junior." "How old are you?" "I'm 16. Orrin, directing your attention to April 20, 1974, which is a Saturday, do you have an opportunity to see and talk to Vernon Crawford?" "Yes, sir, I did." "And where were you when you talked to him?" "I was working at the station." "What's that?" That's at Jerry Shell on Main and Vine. Approximately what time did you talk to him? I'm not sure, but I think it was 7 o'clock. In the evening? Yes, sir. Tell us what you talked about. Well, he asked me if I wanted to go rolling Indians, and I said, no, I'm working. He said, well, okay then, and he drove off. Was he alone? No, sir, he was with a friend, a boy. Do you know who that person was? Not for sure. Was he in a vehicle? Yes, sir, he was, in a light blue Galaxy. I don't know the year, but it was an old make. When was the next time you saw Mr. Crawford? Next Monday at school. At that time, did you discuss anything regarding the deaths of 2 Navajo Indians north of town? Yes, sir. All right, what caused you to discuss this matter with Mr. Crawford? Well, in third person, which is history class, the teacher brought up the subject that there were 2 Indians that were unalive, that had been unalive brutally, and I got to thinking that it was Vernon Crawford. Would you tell us why you discussed this with Mr. Crawford? Like I said, when the teacher told us about it, I kind of wondered if it was him, 'cause that night he asked me if I wanted to go rolling Indians with him. And so it brung to my mind that he might have done it. So at lunch I asked him. During lunch we go to the Tijuana Taco. And on the way down there and back, I asked him and talked to him about it. Tell us how the conversation came up. Well, we got in the car and we went to eat. I asked him then, I said, did you kill those Indians? And he didn't give me an answer. All he said was, don't talk about it. And then I started asking, kind of pushing him, and then he told me that they took them out in the hills and they pushed them off cliffs and burned them with, hot plastic and so on. Did he tell you who was with him? Yes, sir, I recall he said Peter Burke. And he and Peter Burke friends? Yes, they are. Are he and Peter Burke friends? Yes, sir, they are. Oren, what did he specifically say about this incident? Well, I started asking him, where they killed them at? And he said they killed them out Chokecherry. Then I asked him where they picked them up at, and he said they picked them up at the Esquire bar. They were walking down the sidewalk and he got out and asked them to get in. This is what he said, and they took them out to the desert, and he said that they pushed them off the cliff and threw rocks on them and poured hot plastic on one of them. He said that one was about 3 miles apart from the other. He said that the other one was kind of big, and he said that was the father and the younger was his son. Did he tell you how they burned the Indians? Yes, sir. He said they got hot plastic cups and they lit them on fire, and as they melted, the hot plastic dripped on them. Did he say anything about striking any of them with rocks? Yes, sir. He said that they were throwing rocks at them. Did he say anything about beating the Indians? Yes, sir. He said he kicked them, hit them, and kicked sand on them. Do you know whether or not Mr. Crawford wears waffle stompers as a habit? Yes, sir. I remember him telling me once that they were the best shoes he ever had because they were so comfortable. Oren, did you discuss with him the possibility of getting caught doing those acts? Yes, sir. I asked him what he would do if he got caught, and he said, well, I'm not going to get caught because nobody saw me. And I said, well, how do you know? And he said there was only one car that drove by, and we had our lights out, and it drove by slow, and we waited for about half an hour, and then we left. Oren, is this statement of your own free will? Yes, sir, it is. The following is part of an answer by Orrin Thacker. The tape recorder must have been working properly. for the question and the first part of the answer are not recorded on the tape. Like to, 'cause he'd laugh and he'd run around saying, "Oh goody," and all this kind of stuff, and he gave the impression that he just liked it for doing it instead of for money. He seem to you to be mentally unstable? Yes, sir, he did. I think he's crazy. Driving north away from the police station where Thacker's statement had been tape recorded toward the address obtained for Peter Burke, took Lieutenant Miller along the outskirts of town. The views extended clearly to the Colorado state line, but he saw none of the country passing by his windows. He was too absorbed in thought. You see, people do a lot of cruel things when you're in law enforcement. Finally, you don't put anything past the old boy you've lived next door to all your life. Nothing surprises you anymore. You know, anybody is capable of anything. If he's done it. And yet it came with a jolt. I can't deny it. To find out that one of the killers who had held this community in terror for almost a week and was none other than a kid who grew up here, went to school here, and I know his mother, and he used to play with my son when he was a boy. Miller would be the arresting officer for Peter Burke because he used to live on the same street as the Burkes and could recognize the boy by sight. He parked in the lot outside the Coronado Apartments, a two-story stucco complex on North Dustin Avenue, less than a mile from the high school, and proceeded to apartment 26. His knowledge that both Burke's parents were dead and an older brother and his wife were now legal guardians made this more difficult for him than it would have been otherwise. He knew they were sure to feel they had failed in providing the proper supervision. He countered this sentiment by reminding himself that, as strange as it was to be arresting a boy he'd known since the boy was a toddler, it didn't begin to compare to the way those Indian men had been treated. Mitzi Burke, as pert and cute as an A&W car hop, and only a few years older than the teenager she was raising, answered the door, according him recognition by way of warm greeting. His effort to arrange a balance between friendliness and seriousness felt awkward. "Good evening, Mitzi," he said, removing his Stetson. "Is Peter home by chance? I need to talk to him." "He's in his room," she replied, and called his name. When Peter Burke materialized in the hallway leading to the back bedroom, he seemed rougher than Miller remembered. Perhaps it was the way his eyebrows looked at the bridge of his nose, giving his narrow face a sinister scowl, or it might have been that his dark and flat eyes seemed devoid of emotional current as blown fuses. He looked like he didn't have a friend in the world and didn't owe anybody anything. When Miller read him the Miranda warning, he reacted as though the words had no particular meaning to him. He did not make a pretense of innocence or ignorance. He did not ask, "What's this all about?" He listened, and he was asked if he understood his rights. He said, "Yeah." Tom Hines, the ADA, had accompanied Lieutenant Miller, and he led off the questioning by asking, "Pete, would you be willing to talk about the murders of the two Indians who were found in Chokecherry Canyon?" Burke shrugged. "I don't know nothing about it." Hines looked at him steadily. "Well, Pete, we just finished talking to someone who told us otherwise." The boy answered the challenge with a glare. Miller pointed to the canvas sneakers he was wearing. "You wouldn't happen to own a pair of cowboy boots, would you?" Burke acted like he hadn't heard the question. "If you do, I'd like to have a look at them." When he neither moved nor spoke, Mitzi said, "Go get your boots, Pete." He didn't budge, so he repeated herself, "Go get your boots, Pete." When he returned carrying a pair of cowboy boots, Miller relieved him of the... Wait, hold on. When he returned carrying a pair of cowboy boots, Miller relieved him of them and held them up, turning them in front of his face. There appeared to be a blood stain on the left side of the right boot near the instep. On the other, he found a cactus thorn stuck in the leather upper. Like pins in a map placing Peter Burke at the scene of the crime, he thought as the assistant district attorney advised the youth he was under arrest. The Crawford family resided in Becklin Hills, a subdivision on the northern outskirts of town, whose outer perimeter bordered open range. Under Sheriff Brown, accompanied by Farmington detective, went to the Crawford residence because he and his wife followed in the same league as Earl and Ida Crawford. Not that he considered them personal friends. Ida, a sharp-featured chain smoker, was too loud and, of course, for his liking, while Earl, a large, soft man who worked for El Paso Natural Gas in camp maintenance, painting company houses, was such a good old nice guy he wouldn't holler scat at the cat. There was no mistaking who the boss was in the outfit, which made them an uncomfortable couple for Brown to be around. But that wasn't the whole of it. They had 2 teenage sons, and the older Dalton seemed to operate out of the outlaw corner of his psyche. Theft, drugs, you name it. He had been in it and out of trouble with the law throughout his teen years. But bad as he was, he had managed to avoid the trouble his kid brother Vernon was into. Ida answered the undersheriff's knock, drying her hands on a dish towel and wearing the smell of supper cooking on the stove like a strong perfume. She flashed him a smile. Doug Brown, what a surprise. Come in, come in. When he stepped inside the front door, he saw Vernon sitting on the living room couch in his stocking feet, watching television. Never having had dealings with this Crawford, he sized him up quickly. Big for his age, 6 foot or better, and at least 200 pounds, with fleshy features that were given an animal countenance by a pair of small, closet-weary eyes. Keeping the boy in the corner of his eye, he turned his attention back to Ida, who had just asked, "What brings you around?" He could think of no other way to be than blunt. "I've come for your son, Ida." She followed his eyes. "Vernon?" she exclaimed. "Why, what's this all about?" "I'm taking him in for the murders of 2 Indians." She stared at him for a second, then squinted in disbelief, reacting as any parent in her situation would, as he imagined he would have reacted if the same charge had been against his own child. There must be some mistake. "I wish there were," he said, and meant it. He turned to face the kid. "Let's go." Vernon Crawford looked at his mother, and as Brown would later describe the scene, he went to squalling like he got his foot caught in a trap. "Oh, Mama, don't let him take me. I don't want to go to jail." Something about the kid's behavior rang false to the undersheriff and all the business he told Vernon to put his shoes on. Sniffling, the boy started to slip on a pair of brown ankle-high waffle stompers. "Wear something else," Brown said, taking the hiking boots and handing them over to the detective to be tagged as evidence. "There was one other matter. Is that Ford out there in front of your car? Is that Ford out front the car your son drives?" Brown asked. Ida Crawford, still unable to believe what was happening, nodded. Turning to the Farmington detective, Brown instructed him to remain with the vehicle until a wrecker came out and towed it into the yard, then to lock the doors and bring him the key. After that, the undersheriff led Vernon Crawford out of the house to the waiting police car. He did not find it odd in the least when, as soon as he placed the kid in the rear seat, he was out of the mother's earshot. He stopped bawling as if someone had clapped a tight grip on his throat. The interrogation of the two suspects was conducted in separate rooms at the Farmington Police Department by the Assistant District Attorney for the San Juan County, Tom Hines, a graduate of Farmington High himself, of Notre Dame, where boxing was his sport, and of Georgetown Law School after joining the Marines and serving in Vietnam. Hines was used to getting answers to his questions, but Crawford played dumb. No, he hadn't killed any Indians. The finger story he told around school was just a joke, he said. The finger wasn't real. It was a fake rubber finger he bought at a novelty store. The kind you wore on Halloween that looked as if it had smashed with a hammer and turned gangrenous. Burke also denied everything. Pete, we know you did it, Hines would say. To which the kid would shake his head. I don't know what you're talking about. Both youths were close-mouthed and uncooperative for close to an hour when Hines sensed an incremental weakening in Peter Burke. On a hunch that the boy might loosen up more without a uniformed officer present, he signaled to Lieutenant Miller, "Leave us alone." Hines was sitting on one side of the desk, Burke on the other. When the door opened shut behind the lieutenant and his footsteps faded down the hallway, Hines shook his head. I don't understand it, Pete. Why in the hell would you guys do something like that? He was giving voice to his own confusion as much as he was asking Peter Burke a question, so it came as a complete surprise when he heard the boy reply, I don't know why we did it. Without moving his head, the ADA slowly turned his eyes to the youth. He exhaled silently. Then he called Miller back in and said Pete was ready to make a statement. Burke was asked if he wanted to use the restroom first or have something to drink or make a phone call, but he shook his head no to each. He did accept one of Miller's Salem cigarettes, however, and then in his own words he began to tell them what happened that Saturday night. The room, as it turned out, was not equipped with a tape recorder, and neither of the investigation wanted to interrupt the mood long enough for one to be set up, so notes were taken on yellow legal pad. They would read 8:30, 7/4/2074. Vernon Crawford, Peter Burke. Rear of Esquire, talked to subjects, offered ride, drove to Chokecherry Canyon, fat one, dad, fell asleep, put him in trunk, carried smaller one out, son, told him party on other side of the hill. Vernon pushed off the mountain, search subject burn, both Peter and Vernon burn. We set match to clothing and lit it. Question, did little one run when set on fire? Yes, he kept falling down. He would take a couple of steps, then fall. No screaming, hit with rocks. Bleeding badly. Vernon melted plastic cup in little one's mouth. No gasoline. No personal effects. They did not have wallets, money, or anything. Peter took silver ring off little one, went back for big one. Vernon knew where to go, told big one friend up the hill. Walked up the hill, pushed big one off. Both burned big one, took clothing off before fire. What clothing? All his clothes set on fire. Used brushwood, then put the fire on big one. Hit with sticks, did not jab with sticks. Big one ran, chased, tripped, and burned. Hit with rocks. Drug sand up around face. Little one still alive when he returned second time. So we burned and hit him with rocks. While burning subject car came by, put out fire, hid behind tree. Car turned, so lights on them. Car stopped for several seconds. Car left, so did we. What were you wearing? Blue jeans, Levi jacket, cowboy boots, and t-shirt. Whose idea was this? Both of ours. When did you discuss this type of murder? That night. When we were riding around. Did you try to get other Navajos to go? Yes. Where? Harry's. Have you and Vernon ever rolled Navajos before? Yes. Emotions, no. Why? No. Feel good? Yes. Tell anyone? No. When Peter Burke finished giving his account of the murder night, Tom Hines left to inform Vernon Crawford that his partner in crime had just made a full confession and it was his turn to talk. Let me close my window real quick. Hold on. This is kind of hard, you guys. I'm trying to... 15 more minutes? Okay. When the news was released that 2 teenage boys had been arrested in connection with the mutilation slayings of 2 Navajo men, the town as a whole was horrified. Not since the assassination of John F. Kennedy had so many people who had no personal connection to either victim or suspect felt so personally touched by a murder case. Initially, the names of the 2 youths were not released because the suspects were juveniles, just that they were Anglos, 15 and 16 years old, and attended Farmington High School. But no doubt was left about their guilt when Under Sheriff Brown was quoted as saying, "We have full confessions." Hold on. Did you guys hear me? I had the puzzle come up. I'll read it again. When the news was released that 2 teenage boys had been arrested in connection with the mutilation slayings of 2 Navajo men, the town as a whole was horrified. Not since the assassination of John F. Kennedy had so many people who had no personal connection to either victim or suspect felt so personally touched by a murder case. Initially, the names of the 2 youths were not released because the suspects were juveniles, just that they were Anglos, 15 and 16 years old, and attended Farmington High School. But no doubt was left about their guilt when Under Sheriff Brown was quoted as saying, "We have full confessions." Just in case those confessions might be challenged in court, however, the undersheriff contacted the New Mexico State Police Crime Laboratory and requested their assistance. When the lab team arrived in Farmington, they were escorted to the yard where Vernon Crawford's light blue Ford Galaxy 500 was being kept, which they processed for evidence. An examination and comparison would almost be a week in coming, but the evidence would be overwhelmingly inconclusive. The tire tread from Crawford's vehicle would match the photographs taken by Lieutenant Miller. Soil samples from the area where John Harvey was found were identical to sand and gravel retrieved from the vehicle's trunk, as were hair samples taken off a rock picked up at the scene and hairs discovered in the center of the vehicle's trunk. A section of the left side of the rear seat was excised and examined for prints, which would be identified as belonging to Herman Dodge Benally. The role of the sheriff's department was nearing a close. Suspects were in custody, statements had been obtained, evidence was being processed, reports had been written. The rest belonged to San Juan County's prosecuting attorneys. And then within hours after Lieutenant Miller had typed, "This case is considered cleared pending court action," at the bottom of the offense report. At 3:38 p.m. on Saturday afternoon, according to the dispatcher's log, a phone call was received that by now was all too familiar. The body of another naked man had just been discovered decomposing in a ravine in Chokecherry Canyon. So, this one's actually chapter 4. The next one's chapter 4, you guys. So that would pretty much